In a single winter, without war, without bombs, without earthquakes, 100 million people lost power across China. Trains stopped. Cities went dark. Entire regions froze in place as rain turned to ice, snapping power towers, locking railways, and cutting heat to homes that were never built for cold. Within weeks, the damage crossed $25 billion, not from destruction, but from systems silently failing together. And while the world kept moving, 130-plus people froze to death, many of them inside their own homes, waiting for electricity that never came back. This wasn't the Arctic. This wasn't history. This was modern China, brought to its knees by a winter no one believed could exist. In early January 2008, winter arrived in China quietly, almost politely, so quietly that no one thought it could turn deadly. In the south and central regions of the country, winter had always been something mild, inconvenient at worst. A few cold mornings, light rain, grey skies, homes were built thin, power grids were exposed, and emergency plans barely mentioned snow. This part of the country did not do winter the way the north did, and that assumption, comfortable, decades old, never seriously questioned, was about to cost lives. The first warning signs didn't look dramatic. Temperatures dipped just below freezing. Rain fell, then didn't leave. Instead of snow that people could see and measure, freezing rain coated everything it touched. Roads became glass. Trees stiffened under invisible weight. Power lines began to sag, quietly inch by inch, as ice wrapped around them layer by layer. There were no blizzards yet, no screaming headlines, just a slow, creeping cold that felt wrong, unfamiliar, and easy to ignore. But this winter wasn't behaving like a normal winter. Cold air from the north stalled and refused to move. Warm, moist air from the south kept colliding with it. The result was something far more dangerous than snowstorms, continuous ice accumulation day after day, night after night. Ice doesn't melt easily. It doesn't blow away. It just grows heavier. Transmission towers designed for rain began carrying the weight of several times their limit. Entire forests bent in silence. By mid-January, temperatures plunged further. Roads froze solid. Trucks slid into ditches and stayed there. Coal shipments, fuel that powered millions of homes, stopped moving. Rail lines iced over. What should have been routine winter inconvenience was now quietly becoming a system-wide failure. Yet most people still believed it would pass. Winters always did. Then the calendar made everything worse. The Lunar New Year was approaching, the largest annual human migration on Earth. Hundreds of millions of people were preparing to travel across the country at the exact moment the cold tightened its grip. Stations filled, trains slowed, delays stacked on top of delays, but travelers kept coming, trusting that modern systems would catch up. They always had before. Behind the scenes, the numbers were already turning frightening. Entire provinces reported power failures. Heating systems shut down in places that didn't even have backup plans for cold. Ice snapped power lines like twigs. Towers collapsed in domino chains across mountains and valleys. In some areas, electricity vanished in seconds and didn't return for days. Homes built for mild winters became refrigerators overnight. This was the most dangerous phase of the disaster, the moment before people realized they were trapped. No sirens, no evacuation orders, just millions of ordinary lives continuing as usual, unaware that the systems they depended on, electricity, transport, heat, were already failing together. Cold doesn't need violence to kill, it only needs time. And by the time the country understood what kind of winter this had become, the ice had already locked everything in place. What failed next wasn't weather, it was systems. Across China, the ice kept falling, not as snow, but as a slow, merciless coating that turned infrastructure against itself. Power lines thickened like frozen ropes. Transmission towers, engineered for rain and wind, began carrying tons of extra weight they were never designed to hold. One by one, they started to bend. then snap, then collapse, sometimes taking entire corridors of the national grid with them in seconds. This wasn't a localized blackout. It was cascading failure. When a single major line went down, power had to be rerouted through already overloaded systems. Those lines iced over next. Substations froze. Control systems failed. In mountainous regions, towers collapsed in chains, falling like matchsticks down valleys. Repair crews couldn't reach them. Roads were ice. Helicopters were grounded. Even getting close to the damage became impossible. Within days, millions of homes lost electricity. Then tens of millions. Entire cities went dark, not at night but in the middle of the day. Elevators stopped between floors. Water pumps failed. Mobile towers lost backup power and went silent. What people didn't realize yet was that electricity wasn't just light. It was heat, communication, and movement. Without it, winter stops being uncomfortable and starts becoming lethal. Coal was supposed to save the grid. Instead, it froze too. Coal trains, the backbone of winter power generation, were stranded across the country. Tracks iced over, switches locked solid. Freight cars sat motionless in sub-zero air, full of fuel that couldn't reach power plants that desperately needed it. Some plants ran out of coal entirely. Others shut down preemptively to avoid catastrophic damage. Power generation fell just as demand exploded. This was the moment the crisis crossed a line. With electricity gone, people turned to anything that produced heat. Charcoal stoves, gas burners, improvised heaters in sealed rooms. Windows stayed shut to keep the cold out. Poison built up invisibly. Some victims never woke up. Others woke too late. Meanwhile, the scale of the disaster kept expanding. Province after province reported grid collapse. Emergency power was rationed to hospitals and government buildings. Ordinary neighborhoods were left in darkness. In some regions, blackouts lasted weeks, food spoiled, water pipes burst, heating systems cracked beyond repair. Satellite images told the story no broadcast could. Vast areas that should have glowed at night were black. Huge sections of the country erased from the grid by ice alone. By official estimates, over 100 million people were now directly affected by power failures, transport shutdowns, or fuel shortages. And the worst part was this: the ice wasn't done. Each night, temperatures dropped again. Each morning, the damage multiplied. Repairs made one day failed the next as freezing rain returned and added another layer of weight. Crews worked in shifts just to keep lines from collapsing again. Soldiers were deployed not for war, but to chip ice off towers by hand. This wasn't a storm that hit and left. It sat on the country, pressed down, and waited. By the time people realized the blackout wasn't temporary, travel systems were already breaking apart, and millions were about to discover that winter had turned the world's largest migration into a trap. What happened next was not planned. It was not ordered. It simply happened, because calendars don't stop for disasters. As the ice locked down power grids and highways across China, the Lunar New Year migration began anyway. It always did. Hundreds of millions of people poured toward stations carrying bags, gifts, and the assumption that delays were temporary. For decades, the system had absorbed pressure and adapted. This time it didn't. Railways slowed first. Then they stalled. Freezing rain coated tracks and switches until metal stopped moving. Signals failed. Trains backed up across provinces. Platforms filled faster than they could empty. Station by station, the network seized up. What had been delays became cancellations. What had been hours became days. At major hubs, especially in the south, crowds swelled beyond anything planners had imagined. Guangzhou, one of the busiest transit cities in the country, turned into a human holding pen. Lines stretched for kilometers. Inside stations, people slept sitting up, pressed shoulder to shoulder on cold tile floors. There was no space to lie down, no warmth, no clear information. Temperatures hovered near freezing inside buildings designed to shed heat, not keep it in. Power outages cut lighting and heating intermittently. Food ran out quickly. Vendors closed when supply trucks failed to arrive. What food remained doubled in price overnight. Parents wrapped children in coats meant for travel, not survival. Elderly travelers sat motionless for hours, conserving energy, unsure when or if movement would resume. Outside, roads were no better. Highways turned into parking lots of frozen metal. Buses slid sideways and stopped where they stood. Private cars were abandoned on icy inclines, their owners walking away with whatever they could carry. Some never made it to shelter before nightfall. This was the disaster's most invisible phase. No collapsed buildings, no dramatic rescues. Just millions of people trapped, slowly realizing that modern mobility meant nothing without electricity, traction, or heat. Authorities tried to regain control. Police formed human corridors to separate crowds. Loudspeakers repeated instructions that changed by the hour. Military units were deployed, not to evacuate, but to manage movement, distribute water, and prevent panic. The goal was no longer travel, it was containment. Illness spread quickly in the packed halls. Coughs echoed through stations that never slept. Minor injuries went untreated. Some travelers collapsed and were carried out without ceremony. Others simply disappeared into hospitals or temporary shelters, separated from families who had no way to contact them once phones died. And still, more people arrived. The scale was unprecedented. Tens of millions attempting to move through a transport system that was no longer functioning as a system at all. Every cancelled train added pressure to the next station down the line. Every stranded crowd created another bottleneck. The migration didn't stop, it stacked. This was no longer a weather problem, it was a human one. Because cold doesn't have to chase people to kill them. Sometimes it just waits, while they gather, while they hope, while they believe the next announcement will change everything. When the death toll began to rise, it didn't come from avalanches or collapsing buildings. It came quietly behind closed doors, far from cameras, inside homes, in rural villages, and in darkened rooms where people thought they were safe. Across China, the cold did not kill by force. It killed by absence. In cities, power outages turned apartments into refrigerators. Buildings in the south were never insulated for sustained cold. Walls bled heat. Windows rattled. When electricity vanished, so did heating, lighting, and often water. Families layered clothes and blankets, waiting for power to return. Many believed it would be back by morning. For some, morning never came. Hypothermia doesn't announce itself. It slows the body, dulls judgment, and makes people feel tired rather than afraid. Elderly residents were especially vulnerable. Some were found in bed, fully dressed, as if they had simply fallen asleep. Others collapsed while trying to move from one room to another in the dark. Desperation pushed people toward dangerous solutions. Charcoal burners, gas stoves, and improvised heaters were dragged indoors. Windows stayed shut to keep warmth in. Oxygen levels dropped. Carbon monoxide built up invisibly. Entire families were discovered unconscious. Some survived, many didn't. In rural areas, death was even quieter. Villages cut off by frozen roads lost contact with the outside world. Power lines downed by ice were not repaired for days or weeks. Aid trucks couldn't reach mountain communities at all. Farmers burned whatever they had. Crop waste, coal meant for livestock, even furniture, to survive the nights. When fuel ran out, so did options. Children and the elderly paid the highest price. In some villages, deaths were not reported immediately, either because communication was impossible or because there was no authority present to record them. Bodies were sometimes kept indoors until roads reopened, the cold acting as a grim preservative. Travelers stranded in stations and temporary shelters were not immune. Prolonged exposure, exhaustion, dehydration, and illness weakened immune systems. What began as a cold turned into pneumonia. What felt like fatigue became collapse. Medical staff worked in shifts, often without reliable power, prioritizing those most likely to survive. Officially, the confirmed death toll would later be listed at 130 plus, but even authorities acknowledged the number was incomplete. Some deaths were classified as accidents, others as illness, some were never formally counted at all. In disasters like this, the line between cause and consequence blurs, and the cold hides inside both. What made this winter especially deadly was not extreme temperature alone, it was duration. Days of exposure became weeks. Short-term coping turned into long-term breakdown. Each night without heat increased risk. Each blackout compounded the previous one. This was the moment the disaster stopped being about ice and infrastructure and became about human limits, because the human body can adapt to cold, but it cannot adapt to endless cold with no exit. And as the bodies were counted, another collapse was unfolding, one that would be felt long after the snow melted. While cities struggled in darkness and stations overflowed with stranded travelers, a different disaster unfolded far from cameras, one that didn't trend, didn't broadcast live, and didn't immediately show up in official numbers. It happened quietly across the countryside of China, where winter turned isolation into a weapon. Rural communities were never meant to withstand prolonged freezing. Roads connecting villages were narrow, unprotected, and often the first to disappear under ice. When they closed, they stayed closed. Trucks carrying food, fuel, and medicine never arrived. Emergency crews focused on cities and major power corridors, leaving vast rural regions on their own. Electricity failures here weren't hours long, they were weeks. Without power, farmers lost more than heat. Water pumps stopped, barns went dark, feed storage froze solid. Livestock, already stressed by cold, began dying in large numbers. Cattle collapsed standing up. Poultry froze in coops. Pigs starved when supply chains broke and feed ran out. For families that depended entirely on animals for survival, each death wasn't just loss, it was the end of income, food, and future stability. Fields didn't escape either. Ice encased winter crops, crushing stems and suffocating growth beneath frozen layers. Fruit trees snapped under the weight. Entire harvests that families had planned around for the year ahead vanished in days. When the thaw finally came, many fields were unrecognizable, flattened, waterlogged, ruined. Villages high in the mountains were hit hardest. Some were unreachable for so long that local officials only learned of the damage weeks later. Residents burned whatever they could spare to survive nights that dropped far below freezing. Furniture became fuel. Fence posts disappeared. When nothing was left, people rationed heat by gathering in single rooms, rotating sleep to keep watch over small fires. Medical emergencies became death sentences. Slips on ice broke bones that couldn't be treated. Infections worsened without antibiotics. Pregnant women and the elderly were carried on foot for kilometers, hoping to reach help that often wasn't there. When deaths occurred, they didn't make headlines. There were no cameras, no press briefings. Some families buried their own. Others waited, preserving bodies in the cold until roads reopened. Loss became routine, absorbed into daily survival. By the time officials assessed the damage, the numbers were staggering, though rarely precise. Livestock losses reached into the millions. Agricultural damage alone accounted for a massive share of the $25 billion total economic cost. For rural households already living on thin margins, recovery wasn't a matter of repair. It was a matter of starting over, often without the means to do so. This was the disaster behind the disaster, because cities eventually regained power, stations eventually cleared, lights came back on. But in the countryside, the winter left scars that lasted years, and as the country began counting its losses, the storm delivered one final shock: how much a modern nation could lose in money, stability, and confidence from a winter it never believed could happen. By the time the ice began to loosen its grip, the damage was no longer something that could be hidden or minimized. Across China, the winter of 2008 had crossed from crisis into reckoning. What remained was not just broken infrastructure, but a nation forced to confront how fragile modern systems become when weather turns abnormal, and stays that way. The response escalated to a national emergency. Military units were deployed by the tens of thousands, not for combat, but for survival. Soldiers were sent into mountains to manually break ice from transmission towers, sometimes hanging from frozen structures in sub-zero winds. Others cleared roads with hand tools when machines failed. Temporary power lines were laid across fields and villages, designed not to last, but simply to keep people alive. Power plants were prioritized at all costs. Coal was rerouted by any available means: trucks, emergency rail corridors, even manual unloading where machinery had frozen solid. Some plants operated at minimal capacity just to stabilize hospitals and water systems. Electricity was rationed city by city. Entire neighborhoods went dark so critical facilities could stay lit. The economic toll became impossible to ignore. Early estimates were revised upward again and again as assessments reached rural areas. Agriculture had been devastated. Industry stalled as factories shut down without power or transport. Exports slowed, supply chains fractured. By the final count, losses exceeded $25 billion USD, making it one of the most expensive winter disasters in history. But the deeper damage wasn't financial. It was strategic. This winter exposed a dangerous assumption, that certain regions were safe from extreme cold. Southern and central infrastructure had been designed for averages, not extremes. Transmission towers lacked ice load reinforcement. Emergency plans focused on floods and earthquakes, not prolonged freezing. Redundancy was limited. Backup systems shared the same vulnerabilities as primary ones. After the thaw, changes came fast. Power grid standards were rewritten. Towers were reinforced to withstand heavy ice accumulation. Monitoring systems were expanded to detect stress before collapse. Emergency fuel reserves were increased. Winter contingency plans were extended to regions that had never needed them before. Yet even with reform, the lesson lingered uncomfortably. This wasn't a failure of technology. It was a failure of imagination. The country had prepared for what was expected, not for what was possible. And in a world where climate patterns were becoming less predictable, that distinction suddenly mattered. By spring, trains moved again. Lights returned. Life resumed. But the winter of 2008 left behind a question that no repair crew could answer. If one unexpected season could shut down power, transport, food and heat for 100 million people, what would happen if it lasted longer next time? That question wouldn't stay in China. It would echo far beyond its borders. When the snow finally melted and the ice retreated, it was tempting to see the winter of 2008 in China as a rare anomaly, a freak event, safely locked in the past. Power lines were rebuilt, trains ran again, cities filled with light. On the surface, the crisis was over, but the real damage had already been done. The disaster revealed a truth that extended far beyond one country. The most dangerous winters don't happen in the coldest places. They happen where cold is unexpected, where buildings are thin, grids are exposed, and people don't believe they need to prepare. In those regions, even moderate temperatures can become lethal when systems fail together. What made this winter deadly wasn't just ice. It was convergence. Power failed at the same time, transport collapsed. Fuel froze just as demand peaked. Communication died when people needed it most. Each system depended on another that was already broken. There was no single point of failure, only a slow, widening gap between human needs and system capacity. The official numbers tell one story: 130+ confirmed deaths, 100 million affected, $25 billion lost. But the deeper lesson lives between those figures. Many victims didn't die in dramatic ways. They died waiting for electricity, for trains, for help that couldn't reach them. Cold turned patience into a liability. In the years that followed, similar patterns appeared elsewhere. Different countries, different climates, same result. Modern societies discovered that efficiency without resilience is fragile. Systems optimized for cost and speed break quickly under prolonged stress. Redundancy looks expensive until it's gone. The winter of 2008 proved something unsettling. You don't need historic temperatures to create a historic disaster. You only need unprepared infrastructure and enough time. Today, as weather patterns grow less predictable, that lesson feels heavier. Regions once considered safe from extreme cold are now facing events they were never designed for. Power grids stretch further. Populations grow denser. Dependencies multiply. The question is no longer whether another impossible winter will happen. It's whether the next one will arrive in a place even less prepared. Because cold doesn't announce itself as a threat. It arrives quietly. It waits. And when systems fail together, it doesn't matter how advanced a nation is. Winter always finds the weak point.